Okay, so welcome. The conversation continues. Last time around, we were looking at Berkeley's argument against Locke's theory of abstract ideas. Uh, Now we're going to be looking at what Berkeley is famous for, and that is Berkeley's critique of Lockean materialism, which also functions as an argument for what we're going to call idealism about metaphysics. So, Berkeley is famous enough for his idealism that when Bertrand Russell wrote about Berkeley in his book, A History of Western Philosophy, he included a limerick that someone else had written about Berkeley. Here's how it goes. There was a young man who said God must think it exceedingly odd if he finds that this tree continues to be when there's no one in the quad. To which we reply, Dear sir, your astonishment's odd. I'm always in the quad, and that's why the tree will continue to be, since observed by yours faithfully, God. Now, what's the bit here, or what's the philosophy underlying this cutesy little limerick? Well, it's the idea that on Berkeley's theory, to be a thing is to be an idea, right? Uh, so the question of whether a tree, like the one right behind me here, would continue to exist when no one's looking at it, seems to be a problem for Berkeley's theory, because his theory is that to be is to be an idea in the mind of somebody. That's what an idealist will ultimately claim. Now, Berkeley will claim eventually that, in fact, the world is consistent and predictable, and it doesn't just poof out of existence every time it uh, goes out of the mind of people, because not only are these things in the minds of us, but they are also in the mind of God. So, with our fun little poetry break out of the way, here's the plan for today. I'm going to talk about the difference between realism and idealism about material objects. And then we're going to look at an extended attack that Berkeley gives on Locke's idea of unperceived substance. And then we'll look at how Berkeley tends to deal with objections to his theory. As good philosophy gets done, he lays out his theory, tries to get clear what he means, and also gives reasons for his theory, but then finishes what we're reading. And this is from Berkeley's piece of the Principles of Human Knowledge. He finishes by thinking about objections to his theory. The last thing that we'll think about is what Berkeley is talking about when he mentions our notion of the soul. Does he earn this concept? That's what we're going to be thinking about to finish up. So, I said that Berkeley is an idealist, and idealism can be thought of in a number of ways, but the way that we're going to think about it for Berkeley is a metaphysical thesis that answers this question, right? And the question is, what is a material object? Well, Berkeley is going to be arguing against the realists. In section 4, he calls realism the strangely prevailing view amongst men. But here's what the realist thinks. They say that there are objects, material things that are in time and space, and they are distinct from the thinkers thinking about these things. And we're also going to say, if you're a realist, you're going to say that the essence or nature of this thing being perceived or thought of is independent. So there's a thing which exists independently of our thoughts about it. This is what I would remark is the common sense view we might think. We might think that, like, look, this leaf sitting on the bench beside me, well, it's a leaf. There have been many times when nobody has looked at it or thought about it, but what the leaf is is independent of our minds. It's there, and it is the way that it is, no matter how we happen to be thinking about it. This is the view that Berkeley finds to be strangely prevailing. Now, against this realist view about material objects, we can also consider metaphysical idealism. So metaphysical idealism is a view about what makes things the kinds of things that they are. And the metaphysical idealist is going to say, what exists in the universe? What is real? Well, they're going to say that the only things that are real are minds, that is, thinkers and perceivers, and their thoughts, their experiences, that is, their ideas. And the metaphysical idealist is going to say that objects have no existence or nature apart from our minds. Now, this is what we might think of as a strange and counterintuitive view. But Berkeley is going to argue that it explains everything we need it to explain, and moreover, the alternative view, he's going to say that realism is actually a worse theory. It has problems that the idealist doesn't have. So here's maybe a weak claim that we could get from Berkeley. He says, realism is going to lead to skepticism. Remember, Descartes is a skeptic, at least at the outset of the Meditations. Skepticism is just the view that knowledge is not possessed by anybody, and maybe it's in principle not possessible. Well, here's what Berkeley says. If there were external bodies, that is, things independent of our minds, he says, it's impossible we could ever come to know that there were external bodies. And if there weren't, we might have the very same reasons to think that there were that we have right now. So he's saying, whether or not there is mind-independent material substance, well, in either case, we would have the exact same evidence. And if we think about it that way, we might take the Occam's razor approach, right? Why add another explanatory entity to our metaphysics? That is, combinations of real mind-independent substances and then our ideas of them. All we ever see are ideas, right? So that's the weak claim, right? By weak, I mean, he's not asserting so much. He's just saying, like, look, if there were mind-independent material substances, we wouldn't know about them. Here's a stronger claim. Berkeley will sometimes argue to us in this chapter that mind-independent reality is actually impossible, and attempts to think about mind-independent reality involve contradiction and incoherence. And in this way, Berkeley comes out strong, and he's going to argue that what it is to be a thing is to be perceived. That is, to be this coffee thermos that I'm holding is to be the collection of sensible properties that it has, right? To be the coffee inside, is to have these qualities of liquidity and warmth and fragrance and bitterness. Now, here's how Berkeley's going to argue this. He's going to say, look, ideas cannot exist otherwise than in a mind perceiving them. So, we might say, like, could there be such a thing as bitterness if there wasn't a perceiver of bitterness? Well, no. Berkeley's going to say, look, bitterness just is the experience of things as bitter, right? Or warmth is just the experience of things as warm, right? So Berkeley's going to say that perceiving a table is just to have a certain collection of ideas. When you look at the table and press on it, well, that's having an idea of its visual form. It's having an idea of how it resists your touch when you push on it. Think about it this way. there is no such thing as an unsmelled odor, right? To be an odor is just to be a thing that is smelled. So in this way, Berkeley's going to argue that that unconceived objects, mind-independent reality, the more you think about it, the more you realize that the whole notion seems to not make sense. Now here's how Berkeley's going to argue. He's going to say, look, we perceive ordinary objects, right? I've listed houses and mountains. So I'm in my front yard right now, so I'm looking at my house. If I were to drive out that way, I would be able to get a look at Pilot Mountain, but I'm seeing other things around me. I'm seeing my keyboard, and I'm seeing my coffee mug, and I'm seeing my dog on the bench beside me. Well, you might say that, furthermore, you can't perceive anything but an idea. So I'm having perceptual awareness of ordinary objects like houses and mountains. The only thing that can be in my mind is an idea. Berkeley's going to say, this is the insight that we should pull out of the thought that there is no such thing as an unsmelled odor. And from this, we should conclude, Berkeley thinks, that ordinary objects are ideas, right? So the coffee that I took a sip of a moment ago is a combination of my perception of its warmth, my perception of its fragrance, my perception of its bitterness. So Berkeley's going to realize that if you are a realist, someone like Locke, you are going to say you can conceive of objects, things like Pilot Mountain, existing unconceived by anyone. Berkeley's going to point out that every time you try to do that, every time you try to think of an unconceived object, well, all you can ever do is think about the ways in which you could conceive of it. And every time you do try to think of an unconceived object, you conceived it. So here's how Berkeley might be arguing here. It's contradictory to conceive the unconceived. And in this way, it's going to undermine not only just this general notion of mind-independent reality, but it's also going to undermine Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Remember, Locke said that our ideas of primary qualities are ideas of ways things are separate from our mind, such that our ideas can match up with the way that a thing really is independent of the mind. Well, if you can never get out of your mind, you can never be certain how much there is a correspondence between your ideas and the real world. So, as we might notice, the Wall-E Shawn character from the classic film The Princess Bride, we might think that we should think of these things as inconceivable, right? It is inconceivable to think of mind-independent material reality or stuff beyond our thoughts. Every time you try to think of something beyond your thoughts, all you can do is have yet another thought. So let's continue to build this attack on Locke here. Getting a little bit out of the sun. We can actually see this as a continuation of Berkeley's critique of abstract ideas. Remember, Locke told us that we have the abstract idea of something like a triangle. Well, the abstract idea of a triangle is supposed to be what we see as in common between all the triangles, but then we're supposed to form some mental image of a triangle that is equilateral, isosceles, and scalene. All of these and none of these all at once. And Berkeley says, we have no idea of these triangles. They don't explain how we learn or communicate things. and they involve contradictions. Now, in parallel, Berkeley is going to argue, hey, we don't have an idea of material substance. Every time you try to think of a thing, all you can think of is the collection of ideas surrounding that thing. We also notice that supposing mind-independent material reality exists will actually lead us to skepticism. And in fact, Locke told us that when it comes to substance, material substance, we know what it does, but its actual nature and what it's really like, Locke is basically willing to admit, I know not what. And last point, as we noticed when we tried to conceive of the unconceived, well, there's something inherently contradictory about it. Now, as we do when we do philosophy well, we should think of some possible ways that Locke might stand up for himself here. So we might consider like a first defense of realism that Locke might give. And Locke might tell us that there are material substances and our ideas of primary qualities resemble them. So the idea might be, my idea of the coffee thermos some distance away from me now is cylindrical. Now I've got it back with me. Well, my idea of its cylindrical nature is a mental image that resembles or represents the real thing. A couple of points that Berkeley's going to raise here. First, he's going to say, it's actually impossible to think about shape, to mentally image a shape in your mind, but not give some color to it. Well, Locke pointed out that, color is supposed to be a secondary quality. That's mind-dependent. But it's this mind-dependent stuff that we're using to represent the mind-independent stuff, the shapes. If we think about the idea that, look, in order to form a mental image of something, we need contrasting colors, we might say that there is something inherently mind-dependent about this whole idea of forming mental images of primary qualities. Even if we did shape through touch, we might say that texture is in a certain way more mind-dependent than it is mind-independent. Something that might feel smooth to me might feel bumpy or rocky to an ant. So there might be relativity in even that perception. But Berkeley's bigger point is where he claims that nothing can be like an idea but another idea. Like we might say that material substance would have to be something quite different than our ideas of properties. But we'll remember for Locke, thinking about primary qualities, well, the primary quality is supposed to be this resemblance relationship between the thing and the idea of it. But if ideas can't be like anything other than ideas, that is, like colors can't be like anything but colors, smells can't be like anything but smells, then we might even say that shapes, the idea of shape, can't be anything like some sort of mind-independent objective shape. Berkeley's going to say, well, this is because when we're talking about shape, shape is just an idea. It's just a mind-dependent concept, just like color or sound or heat is. Now here's a second defense of realism that Locke might give us. Locke might tell us that we should believe there is an external world outside of our minds because we get our ideas involuntarily. Now, Berkeley's going to say, just because we get our ideas involuntarily, that is, like I look out and right now, the sun happens to be in my eyes, right? And we say, like, I didn't conjure up the sun and ask it to be in my eyes, it just is. Right? Well, Berkeley is going to say, just because there is a way in which ideas come to you even though you're not asking for them, he's still going to say, the ideas of sense are more strong, lively, and distinct than those of imagination. So what I just imagine for myself, like if I imagine myself being in the shade, that doesn't impress my mind in the same way that, um, you know, my actual sense perception of having the sun in my eyes actually functions. So, in this sense, he's admitting that we do get some ideas involuntarily, but he's going to point out that we get ideas involuntarily, also that they have steadiness, order, and coherence, that it's not just some random experiences. Well, Berkeley's explanation for this says that we should take the coherence of our ideas as testimony that the author of these ideas is wise and benevolent. So in other words, we can explain the coherence of the ideas that come to us even though we're not asking for them, as explained by God, right? So God is the reason why you have consistent and coherent sense experiences. Now, from 34 onward in this chapter of Principles of Human Knowledge, Berkeley begins to consider objections. I'm going to look at one objection, and we'll see how Berkeley is trying to approach the objections. I will point out that, for instance, when we look at Berkeley's theory, well, it tends to be that when people hear the idea that to be is to be perceived, they just find it completely implausible. And moreover, they're going to think that whereas we had maybe a plausible attack on Locke when he argued against abstract ideas, there's something obviously going against common sense in Berkeley's argument against material substance. So, let's try to figure out what Berkeley says against this view that idealism goes against common sense. Now, I'm going to move things into the shade here. So here's what Berkeley says. But, say you, it sounds very harsh to say we eat and drink ideas. Right? To be is just to be perceived in a certain way. That we are clothed with ideas. Seems like I'm clothed with a jacket, not with ideas. Says, I acknowledge that it does sound harsh, the word idea not being used in common discourse to signify the several combinations of sensible qualities which are called things. And it is certain that any expression which varies from the familiar use of language will seem harsh and ridiculous. So here, it seems that Berkeley recognizes that many people would be unimpressed with the idea that my house or Pilot Mountain are just a bunch of ideas, because we usually have a distinction in our heads between, say, perceptions and reality. Berkeley continues, though, but this doth not concern the truth of the proposition, which in other words is no more to say that we are fed and clothed with those things which we perceive immediately by our senses. So here, Berkeley seems to be pointing out that when we really talk about idealism, what we're saying is to be a thing is to be a certain kind of collection of ideas. And we do have, say, a difference that we can name between a house and our imagination of that same house. Right? So, for instance, the hardness or softness, color, taste, warm, figure of such like qualities, which combined together constitute the several sorts of victuals and apparel that have been shown only to exist in the mind that perceives them. And this is all that's meant by calling them ideas. So he's saying, when I say that a thing is made of ideas, what I'm saying is to be a thing and to be the way that it is to have a certain collection of experienceable properties. And he says, this is the word if it was ordinarily used as thing. And to say that we are housed and clothed and we eat things, well, that makes perfect sense for Berkeley. And once we understand that to be a thing is to be a collection of ideas, and we don't need to appeal to a further concept of material substance, Berkeley is going to say, then to say that we eat ideas, that we are clothed by ideas, is not harsh and it's not ridiculous. So he says, I am not disputing about the propriety, but the truth of the expression. So even if it sounds weird to people, even if it seems harsh to some, he's saying, if therefore you agree with me that we eat and that what we are eat and drink are clad with the immediate objects of sense, which cannot exist unperceived without the mind, I shall readily grant it is more proper or conformable to custom that they should be called things rather than ideas. So part of how Berkeley is going to argue here is that, yeah, the view seems completely unintuitive and nonsensical, perhaps, at first. But if we can get on board with this idea that to be a thing doesn't need any more than to be a collection of properties, then we don't need to appeal to the concept of material substance. And in this way, it would make sense to use the idea of collection of ideas as a way of talking about what we're referring to when we refer to things. So, here's one last thing I want to finish with, and this is a puzzle for Berkeley. Berkeley is saying that we could never know that material substances exist, right? All we have is collections of perceptions. But early on in his principles, and later as he goes, he will claim that, well, yes, there are no material substances, but mental substances, the mind, do exist. He says that when it comes to ideas, he points out that an idea has no power or agency. Ideas don't do things in the way that people do. And he argues on this grounds that something else must be the cause of ideas. And of course, here he's going to go back to God, right? So things exist even when we're not looking about them because they're still in the mind of God. And he's going to say that that is an explanation that explains the coherence and reliability of certain perceptions. Now, he argues that when it comes to your mind, you don't perceive your mind itself, but you perceive its effects. And in this way, he's going to say, and in section 27, he says, we don't perceive the soul directly, but we understand that it is what ideas must occur within. Here he's saying that we have a notion of the spirit or soul implicit in our understanding of the mind's operations. But I think that this leads to a puzzle for Berkeley, right? On the one hand, it seems like we are not thinking about the properties of the soul, but we're maybe saying that the soul is a big something. Properties of it, we know not what. And it makes us wonder whether possibly there's an objection to Berkeley that he's made all these arguments against the existence of material substance, uh, but shouldn't those arguments apply in the same way to mental substance? Why can't we say, for instance, that we have a notion of material mind-independent reality in the same way that Berkeley thinks that we have a notion of the soul? Or we could argue in the other way. So, for instance, we could argue that there is uh, a notion of the soul, but why can't we also say we have a notion of mind-independent material reality? So there is a question here about whether we have some special direct understanding of the soul that we can appeal to in a way that we can't appeal to in the concept of material reality. Uh, Now, one thing that we might say is that, look, we perceive our minds and our souls directly. We can only ever perceive and experience the material world indirectly. That might be the idea, and this might be the way in which we do have a notion of the mind, but we don't have a notion of the material world. Uh, but I do think that this is something that maybe Berkeley or defenders of Berkeley could have said a little bit more about. But just to sum up where we've gotten, right? We've looked at the difference between materialism or realism and idealism about material objects. Berkeley opts for idealism, and we see a number of attacks against the Lockean approach. So, for instance, we see an attack on material substance in the same way that we see an attack on general ideas. Uh, Berkeley is also unimpressed with Locke's notion of the primary-secondary distinction. For Berkeley, really, every quality is a secondary quality. And moreover, certain ways that Locke has of defending his view, such as the idea that we get our ideas whether we're asking for them or not, this involuntariness of our ideas. Berkeley has answers to these problems by appealing to God. But at the end, we also find a puzzle for Berkeley when he appeals to the notion of our soul, which we apparently do have an understanding of in a way that we don't have an understanding of material substance. But I will leave these challenges that Berkeley gives us, as well as the challenge for Berkeley and his defenders, for you to reflect on. So thanks as always for listening in, and be well.